This time on EV Experience Canada. I'm going to dive into the charging experience as I drive across Canada from London, Ontario, all the way out to Invermere, British Columbia. We'll take a look at not only the charging experience with various charging networks, but the actual cost. Finally, I'll do a comparison of the total cost of the trip to what the total cost would have been using a gas vehicle. This trip from London to Invermere was a total of 3,708 kilometers spread over 6 days. I made 5 stops along the way and a total of 20 charging stops. On average, I drove 195 kilometers between charges. On the first day, I traveled from London, Ontario, stopping at Sarnia, Ontario for a charge, then Bay City, Michigan, Gaylord, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie was my last charge before moving on to Pancake Bay Provincial Park and stopping there for the night. Along the way, I kept a tally of my actual use and out-of-pocket costs for the electricity that I was using. After the first day and then arriving at Pancake Bay Provincial Park, I had actually used $82.51 of electricity, but I was out of pocket only $61.49 after considering free chargers and a promotional discount from Petro-Canada. On the first day, generally the charging was a very positive experience. The only issue I really had was when I pulled into Sault Ste. Marie and plugged into a Petro-Can charger. The first charger I plugged into only got me up to about 38 kilowatts, and I had to move to the other charger. So still success as far as getting a charge, but a little bit of a question as to which of the two chargers was going to work better. Bay City, Michigan, I stopped at an Electrify America charger, and as I was charging up myself, a Rivian pulled in, and this was the first time I'd seen one up close. I have to admit that for me, that blue color is quite attractive and neat looking vehicle. And consistent with the experience across the trip, lots of Tesla chargers, and in this case, lots of Teslas plugged in. At Gaylord, Michigan, I stopped again at an Electrify America charger, and as I was charging, a Volkswagen ID4 pulled in, and I had a nice conversation with this couple from Germany. After the charge in Gaylord, Michigan, I was off across the Mackinac Bridge and then into the Upper Peninsula through the UP and back into Canada at Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Pancake Bay Provincial Park was my first camping night and actually the first time ever camping out of the e-tron. Day 2 was a short trip from Pancake Bay Provincial Park to Naze Provincial Park. I made 2 stops along the way for charging, one in Wawa, Ontario and one in White River, Ontario. My charging cost tally for the end of day 2 was an actual use of $105.96, but out of pocket so far of only $70.08 Canadian. You'll notice here that I show the Petro-Can charge as $14.86 with the actual paid being 0. This is going to be consistent for the first $100 of charging at Petro-Can as I've used their promotional offer to connect my RBC credit card to my PetroPoints card. So rather than getting 3 cents a liter discount on fuel, I'm actually getting the first $100 of energy charging for free. So I actually used that full amount during this trip, and I'm back to paying for Petro-Can charging. You'll also notice that I marked the experience with Petro-Can here positive and negative again. This is a theme that I've experienced across the country. Usually when there are Petro-Can chargers, there's 2 stations, and at least one of them is either slow or not functioning. So my experience with Petro-Can so far has been a mixed story. The trip across from Pancake Bay to Naze Provincial Park was beautiful. North of Superior is absolutely gorgeous country, and despite the weather being rainy and gray, I really enjoyed that drive.
about your boyfriend, tell him he's a rock star. Throwing TVs out the window, dancing on them cop cars. Private schools and tennis lessons, guess I got the wrong aesthetic. Leaving you and it's for good to be a man I never could. You used to be my main thing, turned into my secret. But these nights have got to end. You have my heart, but you can't keep it. I'm moving on, oh, when we're moving on, can we just move along? What are we proving on? Can we just moving on? Can we move along? Moving on, can we move along? I'm moving on.
Couple stops along the way. One was in Wawa for breakfast, and this is not the Wawa Canadian Goose, but there are at least three in town that I saw, and this was one that was on top of the restaurant. I then stopped at Nays Provincial Park, where I met up with my daughter and her husband. We had a wonderful campfire and camped the night. Next morning, it was just about to start to rain as I was starting to pack up, but it was a beautiful sunrise. Day 3 was my longest day of all of the 6 days. This was close to 900 kilometers. And on that day, I traveled from Nays Provincial Park through Terrace Bay, Thunder Bay, Ignace, Ontario, Dryden, Ontario, Kenora, and ended up in a hotel in Winnipeg due to weather. Camping was not going to be an option that night due to severe weather, so I picked up a hotel, and that's where I stayed. The charging experience on day 3 was very positive. Never had an issue, and I have to admit that all the way along, and this goes for the entire trip, I've never had any range anxiety, never had any worries that I wasn't going to make it to the next charger. There were always bailout points. There was always option for another place to charge if I had to, so I never felt threatened. At the end of day 3, my actual use had tallied up to $181.92, and this was to get from London, Ontario to Winnipeg, Manitoba. My out-of-pocket so far was $106.35 Canadian. Day 3 started out very rainy. I did stop in Terrace Bay for a charge, and while I was charging, I had an opportunity to check out their famous lighthouse. And that's one of the things I have to comment. You know, the charging experience, anytime I needed to stop, there was always something to do, stretch my legs, go get some lunch or breakfast, and there was never an issue of waiting around. I always felt like the car was almost waiting for me because I went off to do some things, and by the time I got back, it was done.
Private schools and tennis lessons, guess I got the wrong aesthetic. Leaving you and it's for good to be a man I never could. You used to be my main thing, turned into my secret. But these nights have got to end. You have my heart, but you can't keep it. I'm moving on, oh, when we're moving on, can we just move along? What are we proving on? Can we just moving on? Can we move along? Moving on, can we move along? I'm moving on.
I also had an opportunity on day 3 to stop at something I've wanted to do for a long time, and that was to visit the Terry Fox Memorial near Thunder Bay, Ontario. Here's a couple of pictures from the memorial and a little bit about Terry. An incredible story, and an incredible man who was very, very motivating to our entire country. Day 4 was a shorter day, traveling only from Winnipeg, Manitoba to Moose Mountain Provincial Park in Saskatchewan. I made 2 stops for charging, one first thing in the morning coming out of Winnipeg at a flow charger, and also at Brandon, Manitoba at a Petrocan charger. On day 4, I had a mixed experience with charging. The day started out with a plan to actually charge at a co-op charger very nearby the hotel I was at. Unfortunately, when I got to the charger, I found that although they were operating, I couldn't get them to actually initiate with the car. Even calling their 800 number, they couldn't solve the problem. They suggested another set of chargers that were further up the road, and I went to them to find that they were also doing the same thing. They weren't initiating, and I couldn't get them to charge. So I ended up at a flow charger at a Canadian Tire not too far away from there, and had a successful charge, $14.86. Arriving at Moose Mountain Provincial Park, I again plugged in at the 120 volt and picked up 10 or 15% overnight as a trickle charge. Things really start to flatten out as you travel through Manitoba and head towards Winnipeg. I took this opportunity in Manitoba to tuck in behind a transport truck and try a theory that I had that I could draft and pick up some additional range. With the adaptive cruise control on, I sat perfectly behind this transport truck for a little bit and did find that the efficiency picked up probably about 1 or 2 kilowatts per 100 kilometers. So not significant, but if you're really trying to stretch your power out, getting out of the wind is obviously one of the options that you have. I finished this shorter day at Moose Mountain Provincial Park in Saskatchewan, an absolutely beautiful park. My campsite was right next to the lake and had a wonderful stay. Okay, so day 5 kicked off with a charge at Whitewood, Saskatchewan, Petro-Canada, where I used $18 of charging, and you'll note here that I've actually paid $6.10. This was the crossover point where I had used up my $100 credit with Petro-Can, so I'm now paying for Petro-Canada charging from here on. Day 5 was a trip from Moose Mountain Provincial Park across to Medicine Hat, traveling across Saskatchewan and into Alberta. You'll note that on day 5, I'm showing Petro-Canada having a positive experience in Whitewood. Absolutely a great place to plug in and charge. I plugged in, went in for some breakfast, and got a good charge there. However, when I got to Regina and also in Swift Current, I had 2 negative experiences, and both of them were with Petro-Can. In Regina, I had planned to charge at a Petro-Can. When I got there, plugged in, found that it was very, very slow. Even though it was a fast charger, I was only getting about 43 kilowatts. And so I decided to bail from that and jump over to right across the street, a co-op. And at the co-op, I got a good connection, a good charge rate. And by the time I had gone in and bought a couple of things for lunch, I was able to do a few pieces of email and then get on the road. In Swift Current, Saskatchewan, again, I had planned to connect at a Petro-Can and found that I couldn't initiate at all with the one charger that was available. The other charger was running, but it sounded like it was quite slow as well. The car that was charged into it, they were complaining about the speed. So, also in Swift Current, I jumped over to a co-op charger and found that connected perfectly. And I actually went off and had lunch with a friend while it was charging and had a great charge. So that was a good savior. And again, back to that note, I've never had any anxious moments. There's always been some options. There's always an alternative. Okay, start of day 4 on the road, and I am in Saskatchewan. Made it last night to campground at a place called Moose Mountain Provincial Park. If you are heading this way, I highly recommend the campground there. It was just beautiful. One of the probably one of the best provincial parks I've been in. Definitely a beautiful site, right on a lake, and it was wonderful to spend the evening just sitting and relaxing. Saskatchewan is absolutely where things get very, very flat, and this is where I started to run into some wind. It did seem to change my energy efficiency slightly. It wasn't too much of a bother, and I have to admit the e-tron being as heavy as it is, the wind didn't bother it as far as traveling down the road.
Your boyfriend, tell him he's a rock star. Throwing TVs out the window, dancing on them cop cars. Private schools and tennis lessons. Guess I got the wrong aesthetic. Leaving you and miss for good.
Just east of Swift Current, Saskatchewan, is a place called Chaplin. And I noticed that there were massive piles of salt, and apparently there is a sodium sulfate mine and plant in the nearby area. Hadn't realized that, and unfortunately drove by it fairly quickly, so all I got were these shots. The night of day 5 was spent at a campsite in Medicine Hat, Alberta. The next morning, kicking off day 6, I went from Medicine Hat through Brooks, Alberta, where I stopped for a quick charge, and into Calgary, where I had a couple of stops to make, some people to see, and also some family to pick up at the airport. Then it was on to Canmore and a quick charge there while we had dinner, then on to Invermere, where I finally finished my trip. Just a note on the charging experience here. Everything was positive on this part of the trip. So these 4 stops, these 4 charges were all very good. Didn't have any issues connecting, didn't have any issues with charging speed. It was exactly as I thought. The Petro-Can, of course, was a faster charger, as were the Electrify Canada chargers in Calgary and Canmore. The flow, as expected, was a level 3, but a 50 kilowatt, so it was a little slower. But it was exactly what I expected. A note on charging costs. I had used up my Petro-Can $100 credit, so I'm paying full fare on that charge. So $17.41 was actually out of pocket. Flow, of course, there's no deal there. But then I was back into Electrify Canada. Being an Audi owner, I am entitled to 2 years of Electrify Canada charging for free, but only within 30-minute blocks. So that's why you see in Canmore, as we had dinner for more than 30 minutes, I was actually paying $17.14 out of the $23.90. So the difference there was actually part of the free promotion or the agreement with Electrify Canada, and I was covering the overage after the 30 minutes. Heading out of Medicine Hat and heading west towards Calgary, I planned to stop at a charger to top up in Brooks, Alberta. And one of the things I noticed in Brooks as I was getting back onto the highway was a very large solar farm. Made me think that maybe I was using good electricity at this point. After stopping in Canmore to visit a couple of people, friends of mine in the area, and picking up my family at the airport, we were off to Invermere for a family vacation, and traveling along the Trans-Canada Highway just before the turn that takes us up through Kokanee Park is Castle Mountain, and this beautiful shot. This piece of video I wanted to make sure I included and made a comment on. This is actually coming down a mountain pass, a straight run down into Radium Hot Springs in British Columbia. And I wanted to make the note that I did not touch the brake pedal the entire way. The regen, with paddle shifters increasing or decreasing the regen, actually helped me stay at speed all the way down the mountain. And I picked up 20 kilometers of range by using the regen coming down that mountain pass.
Your boyfriend, tell him he's a rock star. Throwing TVs out the window, dancing on them cop cars. Private schools and tennis lessons. Guess I got the wrong aesthetic. Leaving you and miss for good to be a man I never could. You used to be my main thing, turned into my secret. But these nights have got to end. You have my heart, but you can't keep it. I'm moving on.
Well, that's the story of how I got to Radium Hot Springs and then down into Invermere to finish the trip. And I look forward to doing a future video with a little bit more coverage of the actual travel and the experience of traveling across Canada, which I haven't done for quite some time. I've got a couple more pieces of data that I'd like to pass along just as a sort of close to What's it like to charge an EV on a long trip across Canada? I found this website quite interesting. Canada Energy Regulator has a website. The address is here on the screen. And it was really interesting to dive into an understanding of the different ways that electricity is produced by various provinces across the country. These charts show the comparison of electric vehicles in various provinces, including Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. Note that in British Columbia, where power generation is focused mostly on hydroelectric with a little bit of solar and wind, the electricity is actually considered much more green, and therefore the electricity being used by an electric vehicle would be more green. Not all electricity is created equally. The source of the power generation will actually change the associated greenhouse gas emissions from even electric vehicles. So if you're using electricity that was generated, for instance, by coal, oil, natural gas even, that won't be considered as clean and as green as something like hydroelectric power, and maybe a little bit gray is the uranium and nuclear power generation of Ontario. So I think one of the things we have to remember is that driving an electric vehicle and having that GV license plate on the back is not necessarily the answer. Depending on the type of electricity you're using, the source of that electricity, your vehicle may actually be worse for the environment. If it's completely coal-fired electricity and it's not clean coal, that would be a bigger challenge. Final tally of the experience of driving across Canada and the charging experience specifically. Here's a list of the various charging networks that I hit, and you'll note that my assessment is basically good and bad. There are no clear winners in all of this. There are pros and cons to each. Some of them are very fast, but maybe not as accessible. Sometimes they're very accessible. There's lots of chargers, but in the case of Petrocan, there's lots of them out there, just not necessarily as consistent from a charging experience standpoint. Those that were very easy to use and very functional, seem to always be there and consistent, were typically the slower ones, the 50 kilowatts. And then my experience with Co-op, which was in the middle of the country in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, positives and negatives there as well. Usually pretty good as far as speed when I was able to connect, but some stations didn't work at all. So the story here really is there's lots of options for charging. You have to be ready to actually use any and all of them because your experience is going to be varied. My advice would be that if you're not really good with multiple apps, and I'll do a separate video on the apps themselves because I used multiple apps to be able to stitch the story together. But if you're not good with multiple apps or using apps and you're not really a planner, you don't really want to do a long trip like this. This was very successful for me. It was not a struggle at all because I spent the time and actually planned it out. I was careful to ensure that I knew what I was doing. I didn't go into a day blind. I had my stops planned. I had options planned. But I'm a planner. And if you're not a planner, if you like to, shoot from the hip a little bit more, probably not something you want to take on at this point, just because there's inconsistencies in availability and performance of the chargers. Okay, the final numbers. My electricity cost as actually used, and this is going from London, Ontario to Invermere, British Columbia, through Michigan and across the top of Lake Superior, across the prairies, and out to BC. Actual used electricity was $356.51. Of that, I paid for $210.06 of that, and I drove 3,708 kilometers with that electricity. I do note that even with that 210, I ended up at my destination with about 60% charge left. So there's probably even extra mileage in there. But if I total it all up, the cost per kilometer used was 9.6 cents. So if I had paid for all of my electricity, this trip would have cost me 9.6 cents per kilometer. What I actually paid for cost me 5.7 cents per kilometer. And I want to compare that against using gasoline. I picked off the average price per liter for across Canada. This is the national average from last week, was $1.78 per liter. The fuel efficiency estimate that I use is 10 liters per 100. That's kind of a round number. Depending on how you drive and what kind of vehicle, you'll either be better or worse than that. But versus the vehicles I've had just recently as ICE vehicles, 10 liters per 100 seem to be about right. With the 3,708 kilometers driven, the total cost of the gasoline to do this same trip would be $660.02. And the cost per kilometer then would be 17.8 cents. So that compares to either 9.6 or 5.7. So to sum it all up, to answer the question, is it possible to do a long trip across Canada in an EV? Absolutely. I never had any worries about being able to make it. I always had options. I always had chargers available to me. Some were faster, some were slower, some were a little frustrating, but at the same time, it was quite doable. So as you see with the numbers, it's more cost effective. The vehicle, which I'm going to come back and do a full review on the vehicle, very comfortable, very worthwhile doing the drive across Canada. And I got to say, it was quite an enjoyable trip. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Lots of information, lots of data again, but stay tuned for future videos on the e-tron itself and some more experiences with EVs, including not just passenger vehicles. Thanks again for tuning in.